There is a certain sensibility about my understanding of my own life that informs everything that I think about in terms of making value judgment calls. And it has to do with what artificial intelligence programmers call empathy, which is a concept that has been corralled for utility in political suasion and psychological operations. What it means before you find out what it is an instinctive feeling of awareness of the situation that others are in. So that when someone is sad, you feel sorry. When someone is in pain, you feel protective. When someone is endangered, you seek help. When someone is frightened, you seek to comfort them. And when someone is injured, you suffer. And this is why I cannot accept what happened in Mariupol, Ukraine. To be very clear, I was myself brutalized as a child. I went through something that can only be described as a Manson ordeal. Terrible fear and terrorism, leaving me permanently injured. And I often ask myself, how can anybody not care the way they don't care? It was unfathomable to me. One of the charming Catholic brains of the ordeal used to talk about human beings as just being things. He would swat um, fireflies with wiffle ball bats to watch them fly through the air, and he would say they have no central nervous system. His name was Greg Coral. He's a cluster bomb type who a notorious faction was actually building up a war machine in the Ukraine. How anybody can believe that the high command of the United States is sincerely interested, or at least under Bush was sincerely interested, in the cultural heritage, traditions, safety, and dignities of foreign worlds is beyond my comprehension. So you don't need to fool yourself that I'm asking you to choose sides against anything but dishonorable destruction, and, and in favor of protecting children by um, all available pursuit. Now, in World War II, something was planted in the human species in 20th century and 21st century civilization, which we have failed to eradicate effectively with our government processes, with our education, with our businesses, and with our policies, with our basic values. And what I know of the situation, I first learned from World War II veterans when I was a very young child, when Kennedy was still around. And that was that superior manhood comes from being governing bodies that detest licentious destruction of other people's will and power through dignities such as rights, payment for their labor, and health and safety, as well as education as part of the safety net. And the Nuremberg trials was a good example of the achievement of human maturity. But how did that happen? Well, it didn't come from nowhere. The roots of the Industrial Revolution were in America and the American Civil War, and of course, Marxism in Russia. Abraham Lincoln and Marx were exchanging letters. At least we know Marx wrote to Abraham Lincoln. And Lincoln established Gallaudet University for the deaf. And had he lived, he would have opposed the robber barons and would have been more helpful than Johnson was in restoring the South, just as Garfield's untimely death set back the civil rights movement a century. But the Industrial Revolution came in Lincoln's absence, in the absence of advocates against child labor. So there were terrific struggles. Henry Ford got the first automobile loans passed with the first war loans. The same Congress passed the first war loans and automobile loans. So war and fossil fuel industry and the destruction of the environment's overdevelopment went hand in hand. And Ford introduced a doctrine of advocacy for Black people that got them behind the momentum of overdevelopment processes. Such that in the 80s, when people like me were speaking up about ecology, the New Pittsburgh Courier published a letter from a Black writer who said that the ecology movement was a conspiracy to cheat Black men of their rightful place in industry. How that kind of theory plays out can be seen when Obama became president and was faced with the corruption of the Detroit banking lobby. Rather than use the situation to sensibly restructure America's mass transit system and tell the sharks of financing that they blew it, he bailed them out and passed the buck to the future, which is what they always have done. Now, World War I and European personalities set in motion a mass casualty industry known as war. War had been around for a long time, but never had it been so determined by a handful of incidents. An assassination of a politician, Archduke Ferdinand, the rush to defend national ego, the revolution for the working class in Russia, the very unprincipled hatred for the working class unionism, that tried to protect children from exploitation and labor, gave rise to fascism. Fascism and communism are often said to be mutually abhorrent. The White Rose were generous souls at the University of Munich who protested Hitler until they were caught and hanged and beheaded. A great tragedy. Sophie Scholl and her brother and his friends tried to wake up Germany. They said this dog-like bellicosity towards all things working class, so-called communists, has driven hatred into your bones where it doesn't belong. America had a tyrannical saying, better dead than red, by which they meant that anything that was considered different should die. A lot of Americans didn't weigh in with such poisonous ideas, but they tainted the administrations of Eisenhower and Kennedy, and there was a terrific backlash against common sense that gave us the Vietnam War. America has developed a deficit in worldwide credibility. This deficit in worldwide credibility doesn't come from anything that has anything whatsoever to do with our American heritage. Our American heritage had people like William Lloyd Garrison, Elijah Lovejoy, Professor Griff, Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth. The number of people who've made the wheels turn in American progress, social progress, are innumerable, nameless people. People who you can unearth with the happiness of great discovery. One of these people was a woman from the Harlem Renaissance who was excised from the record books for a long time, named Zora Neale Hurston. Before the academic world embraced linguistic anthropology, she was considered a caricature of her own race in her literature. Nothing could be further from the truth. Her language is sparkling with beauty and hidden resources and treasure. But Frederick Douglass and Richard Wright had both challenged the aristocracy of talent with black talent with great effectiveness on their own terms. Richard Wright has mastery over the literary genre. His novels have the architecture and intensity. They match and sometimes even go beyond Thomas Mann. He was called a genius, quite rightly. But he wasn't so generous towards Zora Neale Hurston. Roy Wilkins of the NAACP, who believed that social progress in America, quite rightly, had to engage the courts, and who worked with Thurgood Marshall from the NAACP in New York, could not stand Fannie Lou Hamer, a rough and tumble Mississippi gal from the sharecroppers family with 19 other children, who didn't speak anything but broken English. But man, was she ever brave, and man, was she ever beautiful. She was solid, and she was down to earth. And not everybody in the NAACP formed a dialectic across class lines that way. There were many people who understood both points of view and embraced them both. Many, many, many people did, both black and white. When it came to the people who were in the NAACP who saw a chance to get ahead by engaging, as Obama did, the warmongering of the American High Command, Obama callously perpetuated the unthinkable things that were been going on in the Middle East. Adam Clayton Powell laughed at King's nonviolence, arguing that Lyndon Johnson was advocating for the race and maybe we should tone down our resistance to the Vietnam War. Because performance in war has been cited again and again as proof of African American loyalty. And indeed, there are some very far-fetched currents from black eccentricism which attack America in the heritage of our ideas in ways that would be completely foreign and incomprehensible to Frederick Douglass. True, he understood and almost said himself there was a hate that hate produced in his 4th of July speech. But that hatred came from being cheated of the dignities of our democratic legacy, not in opposition to the dignities of our democratic legacy. And it's important to understand there is a difference. What happened with Adolf Hitler is that a Disney character emerged from media. The tone of that awful thing he had going got amplification from the radios. And the brutality was so intimidating that people yielded who gave up fighting. And it steamrolled. He was a Disney creation as much as anything else. Man most suspicious in the Kennedy assassination, Alan Dulles, met with him to forgive his campaign debts. These are things we have to watch. We have to watch the oligarchies. The situation in the Ukraine, pardon me, has no right to ask us to choose sides when it is as mysterious as it is. The only side that is reasonable to choose is the side of stop the horror. But we can't dismiss the things that we don't understand about what went on there, what was going on there. We're asked to stampede in defense of the government in Kiev without them explaining what Nuland was doing, without them explaining what John McCain was saying and under what circumstances, without understanding why Yanukovych wanted a pause before joining the European Union. And all of the other questions about 13,000 people dead in Donbass. All of the questions that pertain to the corruption and finance, the judiciary system, who Zelensky was working with that was in a billionaire system that was occupying banks illegally after dark. The way John Schulman was repoing for ancient traditions from the Carnegie Museum. There's no one around anywhere questions, how did Ringo Starr have a system already in place to put me in a situation that was promoted before I even knew that he knew I existed? It's too mysterious to ask somebody to choose a side in those things. And here these things combust into a logical process of conflict that supposedly are at the brink of World War III. What gives? I've been homeless in the United States of America for years. I was homeless in the United States of America. When I see the people talk about in North Korea, they just look like people. They're poor people. When I hear that they torture people, so did the United States of America. They tortured me. These things are organized. They're police state functions across the board, all across human civilization. And the governments refuse to talk about it, refuse to embrace one another because they're in cahoots. What other explanation could there be? And if they don't want that kind of explanation to get around, they need to stop it. Now, our media has a situation going where they refuse to wake people up to the threat of climate change because they are looking at their watches and looking at people like Donald Trump and saying, give us the signal. Give us the signal. We'll wait until it gets worse. So let's let it get a little worse. Let's let it get a little worse. Let's let it get a little worse. Because they're scheming things about how it's going to go. Now, it's important to understand that the human species is here with a planet full of biodiverse phenomenon that are facing extinction. The birds are scared they're getting flu. The children are scared they're getting COVID. There's all sorts of things going on that need to be sensibly addressed through curriculum reform in our public schools. And the only way that we can develop a safe and happy educational system with curriculum reforms is if we do away with, for example, the idea that combative dialogue is necessary to freedom of speech. We need to stop with the grudge phenomenon. We need to have a national discussion in media and online with such groups as the World Wildlife Fund and the World Food Program and the World Kitchen, who, God bless them, have done wonders in the Ukraine. We need to understand what we are doing to ourselves by our refusal. There are so many reassuring, creative, outgoing, happy things that can be done with a person's time other than driving an automobile in circles. There's so many of them. There's so many hobbies. There's so many cooking lessons. There's so many community groups. There's so many sports. There are so many nature reserves. There's so much wonder in intellectual heritage that all of these programs of relentless conflict are an obscenity. We need to understand that the craving to carve out a national identity and a personal reputation through combat games is an obscenity. And we can't get that to register somehow. The people need to develop their skills and knowledge outside of the intense obsession with fighting that goes on in our society. And we shouldn't blame others until we do, when they take issue with us. There's every reason in the world for us to come to terms with one another. We surrounded the planet with observation powers, satellites in outer space. Books are on the shelves to learn about China. You're not a spy for reading a book about Confucius. I've talked to people who've read books that were this thick about China, and the only thing they have to say after having read that book was Mao was a tyrant. That's all you know about China. Mao was a tyrant. Well, that's a lot, man. Wow. Here's your diploma.